Hey everybody, DeathsStalker here. So I thought I'd do a little video about these motorcycle stands I use when I work on my motorcycle, and just some little overview about what to look for and what to keep an eye out for on these type of stands. Now the two stands I use for my motorcycle, the front and rear stand, are actually made by T-Rex, and they are a galvanized heavy gauge steel, and you can see that they're welded, and these are what's called a generic stand. They're not made specifically for my bike. What they're made for is to fit a large range of motorcycles. So this will fit an RC51, it was a CBR-1000, probably a Hayabusa, like any sort of bike. And you can adjust the lift clips quite a distance. So you could actually probably even use this on a 125, even though it would be a little bit overkill for that. And the one thing to keep in mind, that essentially these stands are mounted in two ways. This is what's called a spool mount, where you have a spool attached to the bike and the stand hooks into the spool to lift the bike up. The other type are like a pad type, which is be like an L-shaped bracket, which would have rubber or nylon on it, which would sort of sit there and rest on the swing arm. And I just prefer the spools because they're a little more secure. If I have to really reef on a bolt because it's gotten tight over time, or there's been some corrosion where something's gotten very wet and it's sticky, it's less likely for the bike to slide off the stand with the spools. The big problem with the spools is when you buy these spools, you have to make sure you buy quality ones. So be very cautious on getting ones from eBay, because a lot of them might come from China or other places where they're not using actually hardened bolts, because there's a lot of pressure being used on these bolts. If they're not a good quality bolt, they could snap off and your bike could drop out of the stand. Not so much of a big deal 125s or small cc bikes, but once you get up to the 750,000 cc bikes, you're talking, probably 200 kilos or more in the weight of these bikes, and you don't really want to have that fall off. Now the other thing I do on the stands I get is these have what's called a dual wheel, and the advantage of that is it's actually spreading the load down. Some stands have a wheel on one side. Some of them have a welded section with a wheel supported on both sides. I would take that more than a wheel on one side. The through part here is with the shaft is actually a good balance on the two. Now I'm going to go down to the front stand because it's not on the bike right now. When I have my motorcycle on the lift, I generally don't use the front stand because I'm using the lift to wedge the front wheel. Now this here is the supporting style lift. These are the rubber pads that if it was a rear stand, it would be your swing arm be resting on. In this case, it's your fork tubes. And the one thing I like about the T-Rex stands is that if you look here, they have rubber pads. So when it's down here resting, because of those rubber pads, it does not want to slide. So it's less likely for the motorcycle, if you were pushing on something, to have the whole motorcycle all of a sudden move on you. It could be catastrophic, because if you're only supporting the front wheel or the front end, and this thing moves and all of a sudden hooks up, the whole bike could drop off the stand. So having something that does this non-slip surface is pretty good. Now these things also are bolted together, but again, these are hardened bolts, so they're actually, it's pretty reliable. I've had these for about 7-8 years, never had a problem. Now the one thing I want to point out with the front stands that I use in my motorcycle, the part that supports the bike is located right here. So it does not interfere with the pinch bolts for my front fork. So I can actually remove my axle and front wheel with no problem. For some bikes, these pinch bolts would actually be on the bottom of the fork tube, and they were like a separate piece of metal that would clamp in tight here to hold the axle in place. So that type of a stand that I'm using wouldn't work on a bike with that style of fork tubes. I'll put a picture up there so you can sort of see what I'm talking about. So you have to take into consideration, most modern bikes are using this style, but if you happen to have an older bike, you want to be confident of that, because you know, since putting the bike up on a stand and find out you can't get the wheel off because the pinch bolts are on the bottom. Now there's two other types of stands that you can use on your motorcycle. I'll just get this guy out of here. This type of stand here is what's called a head lift stand. Now what happens is this particular part here slides up into the bottom of your headstock for your triple clamps. And then when it's slipped in there, it locks in place. And then when you go to lift the whole bike up, the whole bike gets lifted up. And the advantage of this is you can change the tire off your bike just like you can with a regular front stand. But more importantly, you can actually remove your fork tubes. So if you have to service your front suspension, this is the type of stand you want to use, because that's the safe way to remove your front suspension. However, if you want to remove the triple clamps, this is not the preferred type of stand you want to use to remove your triple clamps. Now that type of stand is called a jack stand or a frame stand. I don't actually have one, because whenever we needed to do that on my race bikes, I would use the one at the race shop, so I never actually had to buy one. And I'll put a picture out of it here, and you can see it's just basically like some side girdle type framing, and then you put a shaft, usually like a piece of heavy wall steel pipe that goes through your frame to support the section of the bike so you can actually work on it. Most of the times this is being used in the rear of the bike to take the load off the rear suspension, and that way you can either remove your shock, replace your shock, or change linkages, stuff like that, without having to worry about losing fingers. You can use it on the front triple clamps as well, and that way you can actually take the entire suspension off the bike. What you happen to notice in a lot of race bikes, they'll actually have holes in the frames or openings in the frames where they can put these rods through without having to take anything off the bike. In the old 250 like I raced, there was actually lots of spaces you could stick that pipe through. Yeah, so anyways, these are the stands I use. I tend to prefer a higher quality stuff because I don't want to drop a very expensive motorcycle on the ground, because I didn't want to spend an extra $30, $40 on a quality stand. There's plenty out there to choose from. I know the two suppliers I'm going to put links into are basically in America. I don't think they even ship to Canada, but there are other manufacturers that make these stands. Looking for something that's solid, and check the reviews. If someone's had a problem with a particular manufacturer's stand, in this day and age with the internet, you'll hear about it, because it'll be all over on the forums or the reviews. I hope this gives you a little bit of information. You got any more questions, put them in the comments. I'll be more than happy to answer them. DeathsStalker signing off.